For my money, this is the most underrated spirit in Europe. In Europe, it's really all about Scotch whiskey, and the whiskey geeks all kind of look down on bourbon in a way. Not all of them, but most of them. But it feels like in the beer community, we know something that they don't. Because in the beer world, it's like, it's all about bourbon barrel aging. That's the shit. You don't, like, people don't go crazy about smoked Islay barrel-aged whiskey. People don't go crazy about Speyside barrel-aged whiskey or whatever. People don't go crazy about Scotch barrel-aged whiskey, but bourbon barrel-aged, it's like the standard. And for good reason, you know, it tastes amazing. But still, because the whiskey geek community in Europe is very Scotch geared, awareness about bourbon, what bourbon is, why it tastes the way it does, and what it does to beer, that kind of awareness isn't really there. And so that's why it's interesting to take a sort of deeper look into what it is, why people do it, why it tastes the way it does, and why it's awesome. So what is bourbon? Well, there's a whole bunch of requirements about what you have to do to make a thing that you can call bourbon. It is, at its root, it's called corn whiskey. So it's made from a beer-like thing that's made from corn. You wouldn't really call it a beer if you drank it, but it's made from a beer-like thing. That's what makes it whiskey. There's a bunch of esoteric requirements about, like, the alcohol percentage. It has to be at certain stages of production. It has to be made in the US. And there's one more thing, because when I smell this, I'm not smelling corn. I get lots of vanilla, a big bunch of caramel, cinnamon, nutmeg, a little bit of coconut on the edge. And you wouldn't really get those flavors from corn, but there's one extra requirement to make a bourbon, and that's what makes it special. That's what gives it the majority of its flavor, and that's the fact that they are required to use new American oak casks. This is sort of in contrast to, say, Scotch whiskey, brandy, rum. All of those tend to use used barrels, and they'll also often reuse the barrels after they've been used one time. So they'll age something in it for 10 years, then they'll empty it, and then they'll age another thing in it for another 10 years. But if it's bourbon, it has to be a fresh barrel. And that means that you're getting all of these woody flavors. It's the majority of the flavor of bourbon is coming from that fresh oak cask. So you're getting all of these caramel, vanilla-y wooden flavors from the charred wood, and you're getting these coconuts from the wood, and nutmeg, and it's just tannins as well. It's like a really complex, beautiful thing where the wood is one of the ingredients. And of course, this is one of the reasons why so many people bourbon barrel age. It's one of the reasons. Because the casks are so available. It's also the reason why the majority of Scotch whiskey is aged in bourbon casks, the majority of rum is aged in bourbon casks, and the majority of brandy is aged in bourbon casks. Well, okay, maybe not majority of brandy, but like it's one of the main sources of barrels for spirits aging around the world. But it's not the only reason, because like with Scotch and with brandy and with rum and all of these other categories, it's not very common to be using barrels for the first time and then passing them on after that. It's very common to take bourbon barrels, put their spirit in it, which means it's been used twice, and then they'll pass it on to something else or they'll use it again. Which means if you're getting a barrel from brandy or Scotch whiskey or rum, oftentimes it's already been used twice. And so a lot of the flavor has already leached out of the barrel, and you're just getting less flavor, you know? So what's the difference? What's the difference between like a really good bourbon barrel aged beer? Like I've got a brewery Black Tuesday here, absolute cracker of a beer. Well, there's a number of factors that play on how bourbon barrel aged beers taste and how the bourbon barrel character affects the beer. Of course, one major one is going to be distillery, and this is one that I wish there was more focus on. A lot of the time, a bourbon barrel aged beer, it won't even say on the label which distillery the casks came from, and that has a huge impact on the flavor of the beer. Like, Maker's Mark tastes a lot different from Four Roses, which tastes a lot different from Jim Beam, which tastes a lot different from Jack Daniel's. And that is going to have a huge impact on the flavor of the beer. Bourbon has to be 51% corn, but it can also, there's another 49% there, which you can play with. And often, for example, this Four Roses is 35% rye. And for example, Maker's Mark uses a whole bunch of that allocation on wheat. So it's called a wheated bourbon. And that, of course, is going to carry over and have an effect on how the beer tastes when it's been aged. Another factor that plays into this is time. Of course, it plays into this. It's one of the biggest things when you're buying a bottle of bourbon is looking at the age statement, how long it's been in casks. Time is going to have an effect on how much of the barrel character you get in the beer. If it's been aged for maybe only 3 months, then maybe you'll just get a slight woody vanilla note. But if it's been aged for a year, 18 months, then you'll get a lot more of those deeper notes coming from the bourbon. A lot more of the floral, a lot more of the coconut, kind of deeper, more complex character. It is, of course, very attractive if you're a brewery to only age for 3 or so months because the turnaround time is so much faster. But I think the people tasting the beer will be able to tell. Another factor that's going to play in here is temperature. And I think from anecdotal evidence, this has a lot bigger effect than a lot of people think. If you taste a rum from a Caribbean country that has only been aged for 3 or 4 years, it's hugely oaky. You get all of this barrel character in it. But if you taste a rum, say I tasted a rum that was aged here in Bergen in Norway, which is quite a cold place, for like 3 years, and there was almost no barrel character to be found. Now, Brooklyn Brewery also studied this, and they found that it does indeed have an effect. Warmer barrel aging tends to absorb the flavors from the barrel faster. Colder barrel aging goes slower, but gets less oxidized as it goes along. So it's a sort of knife edge balance you have to walk there. Another aspect of the temperature thing is like seasonal variations. So bourbon, in Kentucky, they'll age it in these open warehouses. They're called rack houses. And there's just open airflow going through it. So whatever the temperature is outside, it's also the temperature inside the rack house. In the summer season, the barrels expand, the wood expands, and it lets whiskey into its pores. You know, the whiskey seeps into the wood a little bit more. And in the winter season, the barrel contracts, and it forces some of that whiskey out again, and it takes with it a whole bunch of flavor. And this happens in beer too. And a final kind of aspect that plays into bourbon barrel aging is barrel freshness. If you think about it, a lot of the best bourbon barrel aged beers, if you just think about them, that come to mind, it's like Kentucky Bourbon Brown Stout. It's Bourbon County Brown Stout from Goose Island. It's Beer Barrel Time from Side Project. It's Vanilla Bean Dark Lord from Three Floyds. And all of these are from states that either produce a lot of bourbon or border on states that produce a lot of bourbon. One of the things that happens after you've emptied a bourbon barrel is there will be like a liter of, or maybe a little bit less of bourbon spirit still sloshing around in the barrel, right? And that's going to stay there, but over the course of a few weeks, it will evaporate. And if you're shipping barrels around the world, they're going to dry out before they get there. I've seen that people try to mitigate this by wrapping them in like plastic wrap, but I'm not sure how effective that is. And just like in my, again, anecdotal evidence as a beer taster, it seems like the best bourbon barrel aged stuff is from the places that get the barrels most fresh. It sucks for us that live in other parts of the world and breweries that produce bourbon barrel aged beers in other parts of the world, but it just seems to be the way that it is. All in all, I think it's like a majorly under-labeled process. I wish that more labels disclosed which distilleries the casks came from, how long the beer was aged on the barrels. A lot of the time it'll be a blend, so it's like, yeah, it's difficult. I see that, but I just like more information. I really want to know more. And like, I think the next step, if you're into bourbon barrel aged beers, is like, especially if you're into bourbon barrel aged barley wines, they taste so much like bourbon. It's just, this is 55%, and a bourbon barrel aged barley wine is often like 12 to 15%. So there's a difference there, but they taste so much like bourbon. If you're into those, you're gonna love bourbon. Go out, buy a Four Roses single barrel. That's like the easiest entryway into bourbon. It's a quality thing. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And it's a great way to learn what bourbon is and gain an appreciation for it. All right, cheers.